Hello and welcome to Filling the Sink, a podcast from Catalan News. My name is Leah Villalba, and today we're talking about the 1971 workers' strike at SEAT. SEAT is known as one of the biggest companies in Catalonia and one of the biggest car makers in Europe. The classic SEAT 600 was more than just a car. It was a model that democratized driving in Spain and got millions of people on the roads and served as a symbol of a rapidly industrializing country in the middle of the 20th century. But the company's foundation and early history are also intricately linked with the Franco dictatorship, a period where workers' rights were limited and freedom of expression was suppressed. On today's podcast, we're talking about one of the biggest flashpoints in the workers' movement during the late Franco era, the 1971 strike at SEAT, what led up to it, and we will also hear from some of the people who organized it. I'm joined today by Killian Shields. Welcome back, Killian.
Thanks very much, Leah.
I am really excited to be talking about this topic today. The two of us, I feel we are often doing these topics that have to do something with history, right?
Yeah, I think if something's working, why fix it?
Exactly. Well, before we get into the historical events, I'd like to start by saying that it was just recently that I found out that SEAT was Catalan or Spanish, actually. And it's something that I'd never given any thought, but when talking about it with you, you made it clear to me that maybe I'm the only one.
Well, yeah, no, to be honest, I was a little bit surprised that you didn't. Like, you've been here so long, you're so well integrated. But yeah, I have to say, I mean, I am no expert in cars, and probably I did only find out after I moved here as well that it was Spanish. Maybe before, when I lived in Ireland, I didn't know that.
Tell me a little bit more about the company. How did it get started?
Well, yeah, so it was founded in the very middle of the 20th century, kind of in the early Franco period. It had sort of two beginnings, shall we say. So in the early 1940s, they first tried to start it. A Spanish bank and industrial companies founded a version of the company that didn't really get off the ground because we're right out of the Spanish Civil War. Resources were low and no one had the money to either manufacture or to buy cars. So it really got underway in 1950, a few years later, by the Instituto Nacional de Industria, the National Institute of Industry, a Spanish state-owned company. And it was a venture between Spain's government, private banks, and also the Italian company Fiat, which is also very known all around the world.
Okay, and it was also in 1950 that the name of the company became SEAT, La Sociedad Española de Automóviles de Turismo. And Killian, can you just roughly tell me how big is the company?
Sure, yeah. So SEAT is a really significant player in the European automotive industry. In 2023, for example, they sold over 500,000 cars, and that was up significantly, up 34% from 2022.
Wow. And today around 12,000 people work at the SEAT factory, which is located in Martorell, outside of Barcelona. But in 1971, it was located in the Zona Franca area of Barcelona, where some 24,000 people were working. And on October 18th, in 1971, a 12-hour-long strike took place at the factory. And it turned deadly when the worker Antonio Ruiz Villalba was killed by the Franco regime's police. And we will obviously get into all of this later on the podcast, but tell me what led up to the strike?
Yeah, so what was relatively common back in that era, this strike was actually started because there were a number of workers fired without just cause, and we can say this officially because even the Francoist courts at the time sided with the workers, and the workers then collectively demanded that those fired colleagues be reinstated. And it's really important to mention that organising in this manner was outlawed. The trade unions were banned. There was one trade union in all of Spain, which was nicknamed sort of the Sindicat Vertical, but there's obviously working within the dynamics of Francoism, and it served for almost nothing for the workers, but it pretty much just gave the illusion of freedom, the illusion that freedoms were permitted and that unions were allowed. But yeah, it didn't really serve for much other than basically the Francoist objectives, aims.
Yeah, that makes sense. And why were the workers fired in the first place?
So there was a dispute between the workers and the management of the company. Without consultation with the workers, the company announced one day, out of the blue, that a huge amount of the staff in the workshop, around 1/3 of them all, thousands of people, they were going to be changed to do night shifts starting the following day. So from day to night, like turning your life upside down, basically.
And you basically had to just accept it.
Or do what they did and protest.
Mm-hmm.
And important to note as well that those left in the day shifts were also expected to produce the same level of output, but now without a third of their colleagues. So even if you weren't being brought into the night shift, your workload is going up massively.
So they decided to organize.
Yes, exactly. To find out more about this, I spoke with a man called Pedro López Provencio. He was a SEAT worker at the time, and he was also just very naturally into trade unionism. He was one of the trade union leaders really at the time, and he wanted to kind of have consultation with the management to try and come to an amicable solution to this. Both sides, the workers were so strong in their decision. They were like, no, we are not taking this. You have to listen to us. But the company were also saying the exact same thing. It's like, no, this is happening. Like, get used to it. Obviously, this conversation didn't last very long. And so very shortly after this, the way it normally happened at the time, these trade union leaders were fired. And as far as the company were concerned, that was their problem kind of solved. It was like the problem went away, and the workers would be forced to do the night shifts. So after this point, the dispute then morphs into not being able to fire workers just for standing up for the rights. Pedro and his colleagues soon went to court against SEAT, and they actually won the case.
Wow.
But the company, still feeling like they've got absolute power, as things were in the dictatorship, they still refused to reinstate the workers. So after that, the workers deliberated for some weeks on how to respond to this refusal, and it was decided that they would occupy the factory, shut it down to make their demands heard. These demands of now having their colleagues reinstated, these colleagues who were standing up for their rights.
And I think the most surprising thing about this part of the story is that the workers and Pedro actually took SEAT to court, given the political circumstance in the country and given the fact, as you mentioned before, that organizing was technically illegal during the dictatorship. So how did they organize?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point, a really important point, I think, to be made here. This is one thing that I wanted to get clear when speaking with Pedro, and he explained that, at least in his experience, his trade unionism was all fairly out in the open on the factory floor. Wow. He never hid his objectives. His aims of improving conditions for the workers in the factory, these were open. Assemblies were held on the factory floors during lunch breaks. Union leaders explained things. Workers voiced their thoughts, their concerns. So we have to make a distinction between organisation in an official sense and organisation in a people are just talking to each other sense.
Okay. I guess also one thing about this type of organizing, as you mentioned, is that, well, they're not trying to, in a sense, change the world. They're trying to improve the conditions that they're working under in their specific factory, right?
Precisely. Yes. Not trying to change the world. I mean, Pedro also comes very much from a communist background, and he explained to me that, yes, the idea in the big picture sense was to create a more equal society for all. But obviously, one day at a time. You can't do that in one day's notice. So yes, within the confines of the SEAT workshop, the goals were just to improve conditions for them.
And then the strike came. So now we're going to hear from Pedro López himself about how he remembers the day unfolding.
On the day of the strike, Pedro and his colleagues met up at Plaza España, and from there they went by car to the factory.
At the main entrance, a bunch of students and people from other factories were gathered to make a distraction, so the guards were directing them away. We entered through a door with less surveillance, along with the workers who were going in for their shift, and inside we declared a strike in the entire factory.
The organisers of the strike took advantage of the shift change to ensure that as many workers as possible would be there to shut down operations in one workshop after another and stand up to the company representatives together.
In the end, between 10 and 15,000 workers gathered in front of the central office. That's when they asked for us, fired workers, to be reinstated into the company.
The workers demanded negotiation, but the company refused, and instead sent in the police.
They began to throw tear gas. At first, people threw it back, but then there came a moment when you just couldn't breathe in there.
An all-out battle broke out throughout the many factory floors.
Al taller 5.
In workshop 5, when they tried to leave, they found the police cavalry waiting, 3 or 4 dozen horses with police and raised batons. They charged at us brutally. Many workers had picked up objects to throw, and some had iron bars and were throwing them at the horses and police. Many workers came from the countryside, so they knew how horses are. So they picked up balls of tar to make a sticky substance to make them slip. The police didn't know the factory, we did, so we were playing on our turf.
12 hours of a brutal battle followed from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m.
Policies molts em sembla que devien de ser...
I think there must have been 500 police, between those on horses, on foot, with tear gas, a helicopter, and they just wouldn't let anyone talk.
Pedro says that in a tense melee as it was difficult to focus on specifics and grasp how things were developing. But he remembers seeing blood and lots of injuries.
Va arribar un moment en què tothom corrent cap aquí.
Then, amid all this, there was a moment when everyone was running. We found out that there had been gunfire, and that it seemed a comrade had been killed. We didn't know at the moment. People were very angry and wanted to burn things, and I had to tell them no, that they couldn't burn the factory, that one day they would have to return to work there, and that the strike would have its consequences, but they shouldn't burn or destroy anything. They injured many, some with live bullets, and this particular comrade, Antonio, who never stood out as a prominent member of the union, or for organizing or for speaking at assemblies or anything, well, he was the one who was killed. We think it was a police officer who fell off his horse, and probably Antonio approached him to help him, and the policemen, being more afraid than we were, shot him in the stomach.
At no point did Pedro expect the police to react as strongly as they did.
L'entrada de la policia...
From the arrival of the police and the brawl afterward, none of this was in my calculations. From the faces some of the police made, they seemed to be more afraid than we were, and they weren't too sure what they had to do. But well, they were following orders.
Thanks to Pedro Lopez for speaking with us. So he explained that their colleague Antonio Ruiz was killed by the police. What more can you tell me about that story?
Yes, Antonio Ruiz Villalba. It's important. The company, SEAT, or the state, Spain, the dictatorship, they never apologized. They never really recognized it. They never opened any investigation into what happened. The name of the police officer is not known, the police officer who killed him. Eyewitness accounts say that he was shot numerous times. Most reports that I've read say 6 times. All in the stomach. Mm-hmm. This was a very deliberate thing. This was not like in the chaos, in the melee, random shots in the air fired. Obviously, everything is completely unconfirmed. We're just going off eyewitness accounts there.
Wow.
It's also important as well, Antonio Ruiz Villalba was the only person who was killed that day, but there were obviously so many injuries. We've never heard any official account of the numbers or the extent of the injuries. Why? Because people mostly did not want to go to the company medical centre for fear of repercussions for taking part in the strike. If you go and if you present your injuries, well then obviously you were there taking part and they could be in trouble for that.
I see. So for many reasons, there are many unknowns about that moment, but the Catalan institutions are trying to make up for it with different initiatives on historic memory. And on the 50th anniversary of the strike, which took place 2 years ago, the Barcelona City Council revealed a plaque to pay homage to the strike and in remembrance of the killing of Antonio Ruiz on la Plaça del Moviment Obrer in the Sant Montjuïc district, very close to the Zona Franca plant.
Yes, exactly. And in attendance that day at the unveiling of that plaque was Carlos Vallejo. He was one of those SEAT workers alongside Pedro Lopez who was fired originally, but he himself stayed out of the factory on the day of the occupation because he had previously been in prison and tortured by the Franco police, and it was decided that anyone who was previously in prison would stay outside, just not get involved in that. Carlos Vallejo's story we actually covered in the 4th episode of Filling the Sink all the way back in November 2020. So really implore any listener, if you're interested, to go back into the archives and check that out. Episode 4.
On the day of the reveal, Carlos Vallejo said the following to our colleagues at the Catalan news agency.
Sobretot recordar que no fa gaire temps
We have to remember that not long ago we fought fascism, a Francoist dictatorship, and that workers and neighbours mobilised themselves to fight for rights we didn't have. What is normal today, to select union representatives, to negotiate agreements, to meet, back then was a crime. That's why many of us went to prison. plenty more died. These days, with so many things being put into question, it's important to remember to have a memory of the future and the present, now that the seed of fascism is returning. It's a moral obligation for those of us who fought in these battles to give our testimony, but also for the institutions to ensure that this kind of fascism doesn't return. We have to be aware that rights are not definitive. Rights have to be defended every day.
A very important reminder from Carlos Vallejo. But just to circle back to the strike of 1971, I'm curious to know, did the workers actually achieve anything with the strike, or was it all in vain?
Well, I'd like to answer this question sort of in two ways, really,
Okay.
to be honest. So, did they achieve anything in a tangible sense? Perhaps no. Not immediately, no. The workers were not reinstated immediately. But I think it's really important to answer that question in the intangible sense. So, Pedro explained to me that this strike led to a political awakening among thousands of his fellow workers, whereas at the beginning they were only standing up for this is an unfair dismissal case against some of our colleagues, and so many people at the time were just kind of like not really interested in engaging too much with politics. They just wanted to lead a good life. They just wanted to do their work, get their pay, move on with their life, have fun, this kind of thing. But Pedro says to me that after this, they saw the violent arm of the state in action. This was much more than just police behaving in a certain way. This was the regime smashing down on them in a way that really opened their eyes to the reality of
The injustices of the system.
Exactly. So it led to a political awakening not only among the SEAT workers, but this spread all across Spain. SEAT as a company was a model of the Franco regime. We have to remember this point. From its initiation, the choice to found it in Barcelona, in a city with such a strong history of the workers' movements, was already a bit of a risky one, a bit of a bold one. And as such, the regime installed many of the dictatorship's top brass in the higher positions of the company to basically strengthen it, kind of proof it against the so-called bad influence of the workers' movements that were so prominent there in Barcelona. So for the entire world to see such a tumultuous strike, so many thousands of workers standing up against such a pillar of the Franco dictatorship, this was really a significant thing. This was showing the dictatorship maybe at a weak point. This was a serious blow to the dictatorship that such a thing, such a rebellion, such an uprising could happen in such a bastion of their own fascist dictatorship.
I think that's a really interesting point.
Yeah, I really do think so too. So even though, no, their direct aims were not met, it still had consequences that lasted way beyond just that, just having their colleagues reinstated.
I see. And one thing that I'm wondering is what happened to Pedro and the other workers? Because you said before that they didn't get their jobs reinstated after the strike, but
Exactly.
Eventually maybe?
They did. So every time that there was any discussion between the workers and the management of SEAT about anything, about labour agreement, collective bargaining, anything like this, number one, top of the list of demands for the workers was the reinstatement of their dismissed colleagues. For so long, this was rejected, but this was number one. Pedro himself, in 1977, important year, it's already after Franco has died, he was finally allowed to rejoin SEAT, along with the rest of the fired workers. But, I mean, this is an important year. Spain was already in the transition toward democracy. It was already trying to shed that skin. So he never had that quote-unquote victory over Franco. He was only reinstated after the death and after the country was trying to move on. But 7 years later, yes, he was reinstated back into the company.
All right, well, I'm glad to hear that at least he got to return to the job that he enjoyed, although it only happened after the end of the dictatorship. And it's time now for the Catalan phrase of the week. What is it this week, Killian?
This week we've got a pretty easy one, but it's important as well. It is fer historia.
Fer historia, so to make history.
Precisely. And it's understood exactly as we know it in English, to make history.
And that's all we have time for today. Thanks for listening. Make sure to subscribe to Filling the Sink wherever you get your podcast if you haven't already. Thanks again to Pedro Lopez and Carlos Vallejo for speaking with us. Thanks to you, Kilian.
Thanks very much, Leia.
And we'll be back again next Saturday with another episode of Filling the Sink. On behalf of the team here at Catalan News, I'm Leia Bilaeva, wishing you a great weekend. Fins aviat. Adeu.